Better reload and check your corners, because in this second part of our Left 4 Dead design series, we're looking at the killer level design. Just so we're all on the same page before we start dissecting it, let's break down the level formula. We can slice up the Left 4 Dead campaign formula into several important components. Each campaign consists of anywhere from 2 to 5 sections, with each section or level separated by safe rooms, which are like your checkpoints, and a place for you to feel safe while you restock and heal up. The first section is usually a little less intense than the others, easing you into the campaign, letting you feel it out. This is not always the case, because generally the fewer levels in a campaign, the more that's packed into those levels, but this usually holds true. You'll periodically encounter horde events as you progress through the levels. For example, to clear your path, you might have to activate some sort of machine that kicks up a ton of noise, including an actual Mardi Gras float, and that alerts the horde. The second game also gives us gauntlet hordes, where you need to run through a constant stream of zombies before you can shut off whatever's making the racket. This is also a good example of how the second game makes for an ideal sequel in the broader sense, because it expands on the ideas of the first game and provides a fresh take on the first game's concepts while retaining what people loved about the first game, but that's a different topic entirely. And then you have the finales. Either you'll take a short path like in Dead Center or a longer path like in Death Toll, and you'll reach a finale where you'll have to hunker down and face waves of zombies, special infected, and tanks all laying siege to you, and you'll have to hold out until rescue arrives. Of course, the second game also expands on the finales. In addition to the siege events, you'll also have to collect gas cans scattered throughout an area, or in the final campaign, run a truly harrowing horde gauntlet, but we'll get to that later. So how does the game communicate to you the right path through these levels? Well, obviously your objective marker will point the way to the next safe room, and all you have to do is, I'm just screwing around. There is nothing like that here. I have nothing against games that use objective markers, but Left 4 Dead routes the player in a more organic, intuitive way. The developers have discussed how they place lights in the game world along the path you need to take. Be it streetlights or a lit building, if you ever find yourself turned around in these levels, it's a good bet to follow the lights. And in a way, this is the oldest route marker imaginable. We're drawn to light. It's an instinctive reaction embedded in our species from all the way back when the light of a crackling fire meant warmth, community, and shelter from the wild creatures lurking in the dark. Instead of cluttering up the HUD with route markers, it uses our own instincts as the route marker. Now, in the second game campaigns, when you're running in broad daylight, there are still some dark areas where you'll gravitate to the light, but in the light of day you can't do this quite as much, so it does force the level design to stand on its own, routing you via blocking off paths and creating more or less a natural funnel from one end to the other. When you actually know your way from safe room to safe room, these areas can seem straightforward, even compact, but anyone who's sunk real time into Left 4 Dead know that's far from the case. These areas are chock full of little alcoves and side rooms. On your first time through these areas, they might make the levels feel bigger or even get you turned around, but there's a lot of layers as to why the levels were designed like this. For starters, searching these side areas can net you ammo and supplies that might elude you on the main routes, and this in turn forces the player to decide whether they want to sweep the side areas and maybe pick up some supplies, at the risk of possibly making the AI director bored enough to spawn more special infected or send a horde your way. And that leads into the second point. These side areas are wonderful for hunkering down and defending against the horde. Sure, on easy and normal you don't need to strategize quite as much when the director puts you in a bind, beyond just playing tight and staying together. But on expert mode, finding the right place to bottleneck your enemies is essential for survival. Unless you're playing the second game and a spitter comes along, but I covered that in the last video. And that goes for the finales as well. When you're besieged on all sides, it can be tempting to hunker down right next to the ammo cache and the minigun, which are usually located in pretty exposed spots. And if you're new to the game, you might think the game put those there because it wants you to hunker down there. And that can totally work. But they also built those side areas into the finales as well. Never underestimate the power of a simple doorway to bottleneck your enemy and make their numbers count for nothing. It worked for the Spartans and it'll work for you. Of course, you'll then have to run out and scramble for items if you run low on ammo, and you definitely don't want to be backed into a corner when the tanks come. But that's the give and take, where neither strategy is weighted above the other too much. The siege finales can be intense, but they're designed so that you can hold out the way you want to play. And throughout the campaign, situations will arise occasionally where you just won't want to go a certain way. This footage shows me encountering a witch and a bottleneck on the main route, but they built in an alternate route that I then take. And this video series is mainly focused on the campaign experience, but of course, in Versus mode, these side areas give you all sorts of places to hide and strategize from when you're playing as the Special Infected. So those are the ways in which this kind of level design gives Left 4 Dead all sorts of mechanical benefits, but there's another reason I like it as well. Now, this might not be a horror series that intends to completely immerse you in the atmosphere, or a Romero flick that wants you to think about the decay of society, but even so, building the areas like this makes the world of Left 4 Dead feel like a fully realized place, instead of a series of props for your characters to run through. Take this office building in the first game. As you descend among the cubicles, you can navigate the conference rooms, you can peer into the secretary's office in the lobby. Granted, interaction is limited in a lot of these places, but they're still there, and they're still usable in the gameplay. These spots make you feel like this is a real world that's been devastated by the zombie plague. It feels like these spots don't just exist for the players, that these are the remnants of an actual society that's getting its shit kicked in by zombies. I like that. This sort of world building is something that you would just expect as a baseline from a super serious dramatic game like The Last of Us, but when the gameplay experience is as streamlined and I would be tempted to say up-tempo as Left 4 Dead, it feels like they went beyond what they needed to by giving it that extra bit of thought. I'd like to take a few minutes here to spotlight what I think is one of the most well-designed levels in the series, Hard Rain from the second game. It starts out simple enough. Your boat runs out of juice, so you dock to get more gas, which will take you through a small town and a sugar mill before reaching the gas station. Then, you have to go back through those areas, but we'll get to that part. And things seem normal enough as you brave the rain and forge through the town. But then you reach the sugar mill and things change. Usually you have a handful of witches scattered throughout each campaign, a couple times per level at most. But here in the sugar mill, this place is crawling with them. Apparently, witches are drawn to sugar, which makes the sugar mill absolutely lousy with witches. All of a sudden, you need to be very careful where you step and what you do, and be wary of every sound to make sure you don't accidentally draw their anger. You might not even be safe from them during the horde event at the top of the mill or in the cornfield outside. Now, it might seem cheap to get witches in this cornfield where you can barely see anything, which would seem to go against good design principles. But I find that if you stick to this central pipeline, and you keep moving forward no matter what, you should be able to make it through without accidentally triggering a witch. Second-guessing yourself is death in the cornfield. So you finally reach the gas station, get the gas, and prepare to head back. But by now, the storm has gotten so bad that it'll periodically erupt in massive squalls that obstruct your vision and make it harder to hear the zombies around you. The upside is, it's flushed the witch convention out of the sugar mill, though you still might deal with one or two if you're unlucky. The next two levels and the finale see you moving back through the mill and the town in reverse through those same familiar set pieces. In other words, Hard Rain really only uses 2 levels worth of assets. In the hands of lesser designers, this would be an excuse to crank out a rote slog through the same basic area to minimize dev time, but Valve hold themselves to a higher standard here. As you're going through Milltown on your way in, check out these rooftops. And as you're going into the sugar mill, check out the machinery above your head. On the way back, I guess you can just go the same route you came in, slowed down by the flooding water and slogging through the squalls. It's not a very fun option. But check it out, if you take this ladder up on your way out of the sugar mill, you can climb all over that machinery, which in itself follows a consistent and logical path over the mill, over the offices, and finally back at the safe room. In other words, they built a whole functioning level above the original path you took through the mill, essentially building 2 levels into one. Unless you fall or a special infected knocks you off, you don't have to set back down on the flooded ground until you reach the building with the safe room. And the return to Milltown gives us much the same. Those rooftops seemed like just part of the scenery on our way in, but unless you want to trudge through the flooded streets, they'll provide a handy path over the town. The inclement weather does change up the gameplay, but I'm much more impressed by the fact that they baked these secondary routes into the levels themselves. Even though you're going through the same basic assets, it feels genuinely different. The comparison I'm about to make is much less immediate than in Hard Rain, but it almost reminds me of Metroid Prime, where the space pirate frigate from the first act can later be found crashed underwater, and your second journey through it feels very different than the first. Reusing or minimizing assets is not necessarily lazy when it's done with this kind of thought. Considering the crazy time crunch Valve worked through to make this game happen a year after the first, I think this only speaks to their integrity as creators. And there's no two ways about it, Hard Rain is a tough campaign, but it's tough for all the right reasons, and I enjoy playing through it every time. I'd also like to spend some of our time together on the Parish, chronologically the very last campaign, the climax of the whole experience, and what a climax it is. The Parish is a tour de force of everything you could ask for from Left 4 Dead. Throughout these 5 chapters, you've got a siege horde event, you've got gauntlet events, you've got an area full of alarmed cars that'll go off if anyone shoots them, you've got an honest-to-God graveyard, all in bright daylight so you won't miss a single gory second. And that finale on the bridge, the finale to the entire Left 4 Dead experience, is a whopper. It's the longest gauntlet horde and the most merciless, except for this insanity. And just like any truly great final encounter, it's going to test everything that this series has tried to teach you. You might be inclined to try and Terminator through this stage, just jack some adrenaline and power through that shit. This will more than likely get you killed on any difficulty above easy unless you're using actual speedrun strats. Your goal here is not to be super fast, but to be smart. Just like everywhere else, you need to form up with your team and stick together. But you also need to constantly edge forward or the hordes will overtake you. It's a terrific balancing act that will test your reflexes, your spatial awareness, and just your all-around reserves of sheer game juice. Every step forward will be hard-won. Of course, the tank that attacks you on the bridge here is easily the most dangerous mandatory tank in the series, just because this big boy will be surrounded by cars. He can end your game in seconds if he starts whipping cars at you like Magneto on a bender. Keeping your distance and watching his movements is crucial. Fortunately, the director keeps you stocked throughout the bridge. The fight is tough, but you'll find several guaranteed resupply points. Just have to nail that final push, throw your pipe bomb off to the side, jack some adrenaline, and brake for the helicopter. Just like I promised in the last video, let's talk about the director. The AI director is the name for the algorithm that randomizes the enemy and item spawns, as well as controls the ebb and flow of the gameplay. Like I discussed last time, the director might amp things up with a horde if you're screwing around, or if things have been pretty easy for you, or it might spawn fewer zombies in the next area if your team is just barely limping on after a tough encounter. And even though these games aren't really centered around their story, this gives every campaign a proper pacing with rising and falling action beats, in addition to keeping things fresh each time you play. So how did that work out in the long run? Well, I can only speak for myself, but I'm making these videos almost a decade after these games hit shelves, so... Anyway, the RNG doesn't end at the zombies. Your pickups and guns are randomized throughout the levels to a certain extent. There are parts where you'll always find certain guns, like this sniper rifle on the billboard in Dark Carnival, or this auto shotgun on the porch in Death Toll. And there are certain spots where you'll always find universal ammo stockades. What this does is give you a certain measure of security, and you can plan for the worst case scenario around these guaranteed pickups. Whenever you're in the second level of a campaign, the big question is always when you'll find advanced weapons. This can be down to RNG. If you're playing on Expert, God help you if you get a tank before finding advanced weapons. One time, my buddy Keith was playing the Passin', and the director didn't give him a single auto shotgun till the finale. The first half of Dead Air's second level can be generous and give you advanced weapons right there on the bed in the first building. Or in the worst case scenario, you might not find advanced weapons or ammo drops until this room here. So, you might have to go through a good chunk of a pretty big level, plus a horde event, and possibly a tank, with starter weapons and without being able to restock after the safe room. That said, the double-back nature of Hard Rain means that you will always find Tier 2 weapons in the very first safe room at the absolute latest. It's a tough campaign for all the reasons I outlined above, but you'll always have that little security. Of course, if the worst happens and your main weapon runs dry, your pistols have unlimited ammo. There's an achievement for beating a campaign with just pistols, but it's really not terribly hard, because these guns will do you in a pinch. Speaking of which, since I am planning to keep this to 2 videos, let's talk about the weapons and how they contribute to the balance. Just a quick basic rundown. You start out each campaign having to choose between a pump shotgun that does brutal damage yet needs a second between shots, or a submachine gun with much more range and no delay between shots but far less stopping power. It's just a choice of whichever fits your playstyle, but a human team owes it to themselves to strike a balance between the two types of gun. At some point, as I mentioned, you'll run into Tier 2 weapons like auto shotguns, sniper rifles, and assault rifles. Now, the only real downside to the auto shotgun is that it's absolute bollocks at range, as you can see in this clip where the charger is completely untouched by every shell in the chamber. But other than that, I will completely admit that it's a pretty overpowered weapon, and I would also make the argument that this is totally fine. Even on normal difficulty, a solid offensive of Special Infected and a Horde can overwhelm a team even if they're all decked out with auto shotguns. And this is still a series that wants to cut the drama and social commentary out of the zombie experience and focus just on the zombie slaying. So if there's a weapon that really lets you get down to the slaying, I'm fine with that, honestly. That's not to say that weapons like the AK-47 aren't powerful in their own right, and at range they're far better at dealing with just about anything than the shotguns are, and the snipers might not seem like a great bet in a game where you need to stay mobile rather than just perch somewhere and take your time. But sniper bullets can pierce through multiple zombies, so maybe get someone on your team to load out a sniper rifle for those big hordes. Again, it's all about coordinating with your teammates and loading out to deal with whatever might come your way. Before we wrap things up, we should talk about how the use of melee weapons in the second game rebalances things. If you pick up an axe or a sword or a golf club, it replaces your pistol. So if you run dry on your main weapon, you're stuck being a melee fighter until you find something. Very good when dealing with a horde, very, very bad when dealing with a witch or a tank. But melee weapons are really powerful. A good clean swing at an enemy is going to be a kill more often than not. The trade-off is that weapons such as the shotgun in the second game have far less ammo than the ridiculous ammo stockades you were carrying in the first game, and that feels to me like you're meant to strike a balance between the two styles of play. And there it is again, balance. I think that's what we've been circling around all this time. Left 4 Dead and its sequel might be so endearing because of their sheer fun factor, but they're so fun because they're so well balanced. And that brings us to the conclusion of our 2-part video series on Left 4 Dead's excellent design. It might be a fun, campy zombie shooter, but these games are exemplary for their enemy design and their level design. If you're a fan of the series, I hope you've enjoyed watching. And if you're not a fan of the series, I hope that maybe I've given you an urge to revisit it someday, or to check it out for the first time. These games were wise enough to give you a single-player mode, but the servers for the online component are still up as of the time I made this video, so it's not too late to get some friends together and face the horde. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. If you want more, check out my website for plenty of text articles on games, film, and more, link in the description below. And if you want something a bit more fictional, it also has links to my novels in physical and digital formats. I'll see you next time.